The rain began like an accusation. She missed the interview that could have changed everything because she stopped to help a man with a broken car. What she did not know at the time was that the man she helped held the keys to a future she had only dared to imagine. For the daughter of a housekeeper, the scholarship was not just study, it was escape. The clock on the dashboard read 8:45, and every minute felt like a fist against her chest. At the exact second she chose to kneel in the wet gravel and pry a stubborn lug nut loose, she thought she was losing everything. She had no idea that someone watched every movement from behind tinted glass. And you, where are you watching from tonight? Tell us in the comments. Now come with me. This is the story of Lucia and of the day a simple act of help rewrote a life. Lucia grew up with the smell of detergent in the seams of her clothes and the quiet hum of a sewing machine as a lullaby. Her mother, Maria, rose before dawn every day to polish glass and fold sheets in a neighborhood of narrow streets and paint peeling from porches. Lucia learned to make a lunch in 5 minutes from scraps and to iron a collar until it looked like hope. She carried a small brass locket that had belonged to her grandmother, a thin, worn disc she pressed against her palm whenever she felt her courage wobble. School was where she dreamed aloud. She promised herself a scholarship, a legacy not of land or money, but of work and study that would build a different pattern for the family. At 15, she had saved every coin she could hide in a tin can. Now, at 22, she had an interview that might buy her a place at a program she had studied for in borrowed library light. The backstory of Lucia is not a short one. She had learned grit in small, quiet ways and gratitude in loud, public ones. Her father had left when she was small and left behind a notebook of drawings and a stern instruction to be proud. Her mother kept that pride as a skill, not a show. They called her names in school sometimes, and she learned to answer with excellence instead of anger. She had a list of people who believed in her. Maria, her neighbor Rosa, an elderly woman who cooked soup for Lucia when the city gave away food. And Javier, a teacher who loaned her a suit for interviews. The apartment where they lived smelled of coffee and boiled beans, and sometimes of damp clothes when the rainy season refused to stop. The street below was a collage of vendors with bright umbrellas, and a bus conductor who whistled at the cadence of the day. Lucia wrapped a thin coat around her and pressed the locket to her chest at 6:15 a.m. She caught the early bus that stank of oil and perfume, and the driver, Samir, called out stops with a voice that made the air feel safer. She rehearsed answers like prayers in her mouth until they felt less like rehearsed words and more like truth. It was the kind of morning that beats at your ribs, a kind of pressure that makes you measure every step. The city smelled of wet asphalt and frying onions, and the weight of expectation sat heavy behind her sternum. The rain came harder as the bus struggled through traffic. She watched a clock on a storefront as it slid from 7:40 to 7:55 to 8:10 and felt the seconds unzip into a corridor of panic. The bus missed a turn, then lurched near an intersection where the street narrowed and a black car hissed steam from under the hood. At first, she thought it was just another stalled vehicle. Then she saw an older man leaning with both hands on the fender, his suit soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He was not the kind of person who should be stranded in that place, his shoes expensive, his posture still arrogant even while he pressed a cloth to his temple. The air smelled of oil and rain and a hot metal tang that made Lucia pull her coat tighter. She stepped off the bus because she could not stand being the kind of person who walked away. The decision was sudden and simple and loud in its smallness. She crossed the wet street, and the rain punctured the silence with its steady fingers. She knelt beside the car and felt the coarse gravel biting through her jeans. She told the man she would try to help, and his first word was a dismissive "thank you" that sounded like a closing remark. But she had learned to insist in small ways, to ask again, to place a hand on a problem and not wait for permission. The wheel was stuck, the lug nuts rusted, and cold desperation smelled like metal grease. She rolled up her sleeves and tasted iron at the corner of her mouth. The scene turned into a conversation of hands and mud and clumsy shared breaths. There were 10 exchanges at least between them by the time the spare was rolled out. A rhythm of asking and answering, of offering and refusing that felt like an examination. Lucia wiped her hands on her jeans and said, "I can try." He said, "You should wait for a tow." She said, "I do not have money for a tow." He said, "Where are you headed?" She said, "An interview at 9. He laughed softly and said, "9 is strict." She said, "Then we will be quick." He handed her a tire iron and said, "Watch the jack." It hissed like a small animal under the car. She listened to the rain on the roof, to the hiss of a passing bus, and to the scraping of metal on bolt. She smelled wet leather and coffee and a faint, expensive cologne that seemed outraged at being soaked. She felt the lug nut give under pressure and the relief that came with a small victory. The stranger introduced himself in stops and starts as Henry Langston. "Thank you," she said. He said, "You are early." "You are late," she corrected, "because of the clock." Lucia had a voice that trembled a little, and he noticed, and his eyes softened for a moment. Dialogue in that moment stretched out into a tapestry of small confessions. Here is how the exchange went. Lucia said, "I have to be there by 9. He said, "Why so early?" She said, "It is for a scholarship interview." He said, "Scholarships are rare." Lucia said, "Then this is important to me." He said, "You could leave now." Lucia said, "I will not leave." He said, "That is generous." She said, "My mother cleans houses." He said, "That does not mean you should kneel in the mud." She said, "You helped me get up earlier." He said, "I remember." He said, it sounds like he was remembering something else. He said, "The jack is in place." He said, "Turn slowly." She said, "Like this?" He said, "Yes, do not rush." She said, "I will not." He said, "You are sure?" She said, "I am certain." He said, "Good enough." She said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I will be." She said, "Do you need a phone call?" He said, "No, but thank you." She said, "What is your name?" He said, "Henry." He said, "You helped me, and you asked nothing." He said, "That is rare." She said, "You helped me once before." "When?" He hesitated and then laughed softly. He said, "A long time ago." He had been helped by a stranger, and it had mattered. It was a small human loop closing and opening at the same time. There were at least 7 sensory notes in the scene. The cold of the lug nut, the smell of engine smoke, the rasp of the tire on gravel, the sting of rain on Lucia's neck, the soft fabric of Henry's sleeve under her palm, the distant wail of a siren, and the metallic taste left on Lucia's tongue. The clock in a nearby shop blinked 8:33. She wiped her hands and felt a mud smear like proof that she had been there. She did not yet know that someone watched from a car with tinted glass, a figure who would later be known as the rich and aloof titan of industry, who judged faces and resumes in boardrooms and in short dismissive emails. They finished quicker than either expected, and Henry insisted on paying for a small emergency service that he said would drive them to a nearby station. He offered Lucia a ride to the bus stop instead, and she hesitated because of the coat she had borrowed, and the suit Javier had lent in private. The moment was a crossroad, and if she took the offer, she would reach the interview early, but the act of staying to ensure the man was safe could cost her that chance. The rain was a drum, and 8:45 seemed to move forward like a hungry mouth. Lucia swallowed and made the choice that would carve the rest of the story. At approximately 30% into the day and the story, take a breath with us. If you were in Lucia's place, what would you do? Would you say, "I will go on," or "I will stay"? Write in the comments, "I would stay," or "I would go," and tell us why in one sentence. Your answer matters, and it might be the story someone else needs to hear. Your voice builds this community and gives others permission to tell their truth. Now, let us return to the wet road and the decision that shifted a life. The ride to the interview never came. Lucia helped Henry to the curb and watched him instruct a tow driver with a crispness that sounded like command. The towman, Jorge, took notes and barked orders while the rain moved in sheets, and the city smelled of ozone and boiling oil. Lucia's shoes were wet, and the borrowed suit clung to her like a promise that had gotten soaked. The tow truck left, and Lucia realized her shoes were caked with black grit and a smear of grease lingered on her sleeve. The clock in the cafe across the street read 8:52, and her chest tightened. The bus back to the center where the interview would be was gone. She ran. She ran through water that rushed into her shoes, and into her patience, and into the skin of her resolve. She arrived at the building 10 minutes after the appointed time. She stood under a glass canopy and attempted to calm the banging inside her ribs. The lobby smelled of lemon polish and expensive wool. There were plants with leaves that shone like mirrors, and floors so polished they reflected the ceiling lights like a second sky. Lucia smoothed the suit and rehearsed her lines for a second time. Then she saw Carla, the receptionist, an elegant woman with an immaculately painted face and a voice that had been trained to cut through entreaties. Carla wore a name badge and a smile that did not touch her eyes. The clock over the reception desk blinked 9:03. Lucia's heart made a small protest. It was the kind of building that treated time with the seriousness of an exam. Carla glanced at the watch on her wrist, crisp and precise, and said, "Sorry, we cannot accept late arrivals." She said, "We are running on a strict schedule." Lucia tried to explain. "There was a storm," she said. "I was helping." Someone else said, "The door will reopen later." Carla said, "Rules are rules." Lucia said, "Please, I studied so much." Carla said, "We cannot make exceptions." The voice was polite and clinical, and it stung worse than the rain. Lucia tried to hold on to breath and dignity. She said, "I need this." She said, "I know." "I said sorry," Carla said. "That is unfortunate." The reception area was a concert of small humiliations. She was asked to fill out a form and asked where she had been, told she should have rung before arriving. The evaluator, Mr. Bennett, looked at her file and at her soaked sleeves and asked a question that was designed to be small and surgical. "Do you have reliable transportation?" he asked. The word reliable landed like a verdict. Lucia said, "Not always." He said, "Then we prefer candidates who can adhere to our schedule." Lucia felt the words of the room fold around her like a tide of disapproval. The administrator, Amelia, walked by with a tablet, and without looking up, she said, "We adhere to criteria for fairness and consistency." That phrase was a kind of formal kindness that felt cruel in practice. After the rejection, Lucia walked home, taking slower streets so the city would not feel like a courtroom. She held her locket and felt the cold metal pressing into her skin. It made a small, steady companion sound like a heartbeat. Her home smelled of boiled potatoes and the faint detergent of freshly washed sheets. Maria was in the kitchen humming, and the radio played a low tune. Maria hugged Lucia and smelled the rain and the city and said, "The housekeeper's daughter came home." She said, "Here is soup." She said, "I missed it." Maria said, "Why?" She said, "I was late." Maria said, "For what?" She said, "The scholarship interview." Maria said, "That is all right. We will find another way." Maria's voice was soft and angry at the world in the kind of quiet way that makes a wound tender. They sat at a small table, and Maria poured soup into tired bowls. The radio mentioned a rain advisory, and the clock over the stove said 11:20. They talked about money and about the account that had an overdue notice. Lucia unfolded a small envelope that had been slid under the door while she had been out. It was a final notice for the apartment, a polite but urgent rectangle that demanded payment immediately. She could feel the letters like a weight in her hand. The notice smelled like paper and possibility lost. Maria counted small coins in a worn purse, and the sound of them felt like a rhythm of scarcity. That night, Lucia could not sleep. The ceiling fan made a slow, patient sound, and the rain tapped against the window like a question. She thought about the reception desk and the crisp face of the evaluator, and about Henry and his quiet thanks. She kept returning to the image of his hand and the way he had said, "You helped me once before," and paused as if memory had a taste that he could not name. She wondered if one act ever truly goes unnoticed. Does kindness carry credit somewhere? She promised herself she would not let the final notice determine her mood. She would find a way. Across town, in a penthouse that smelled of citrus and polished wood, Mr. Langston sat at a large desk, and a tablet glowed with lists. He was a man of great wealth and a reputation for exactness. He scanned an app that aggregated charitable requests and scholarship proposals. He had a face that seemed carved to make decisions, and a walk that did not linger on small things. He was a man who had been helped once as a young immigrant by an old woman who had tied his bootlace and given him bread, and that kindness had lodged in him like a compass. He could not explain why little acts mattered so much to him, but they did. He kept a photograph in his desk of an old woman with flour on her hands. His chief of staff, Amelia, walked in and placed a stack of memos on the desk. She said, "The foundation has been flooded with applications this quarter," he said, "and yet we still miss stories that matter." Amelia said, "We vet by criteria." He said, "I know the criteria, but sometimes the criteria miss something." He said, "What are you thinking?" Amelia said, "There is a piece here about small acts of kindness." He said, "Show me." He tapped through footage from a dash cam and a feed from a traffic camera and paused on an image of a young woman kneeling in mud with a small brass locket in her hand. He squinted, and then the image slid into a close-up of the man in a suit talking calmly to her. There was something in his expression that made Langston sit up. He asked for names for people in the footage, and the staff produced a list. Carla, the receptionist, was named in another file, a list of rejections, a small bureaucratic trail linked to an interview process. He asked for the tow driver's name and the tow company. Jorge was listed as a vendor, and a housekeeper named Maria flagged in a background check as living in the same neighborhood as the woman in the footage. Then he asked to see the application forms, and an email popped up, turning out that the woman had been turned away as late by 3 minutes. He read the note from the evaluator that said, "Rules are rules," and a faint, angry heat rose in him. He remembered the photograph of the old woman who had once helped him, and the taste of gratitude made him think of alignment between his wealth and his obligation. Within days, he sent Amelia to the neighborhood with a discreet envelope and instructions to meet quietly and to not make a show of anything. She took along Jorge, the towman, and a list of small purchases meant to help immediately. The visit was planned as an act of repair and of discovery. He wanted to understand who this young woman was and how a single choice had intersected with something in his own past. Lucia did not know at first that she was being watched. She was sewing an extra patch on the hem of a coat, and Rosa, the neighbor, was telling a story about a cat that refused to come inside when a black car slowed at the curb. Amelia introduced herself as someone from a foundation offering neighborhood support and asked to speak with Maria. She brought food vouchers and a polite offer to discuss scholarship pathways. Later, Jorge arrived with a small envelope and a note that said, "Someone noticed you," and said, "Thank you." It felt like a miracle that the mail could carry and deliver thanks. Maria opened the envelope and found a small check to cover the overdue notice. The paper smelled like ink and relief, and Maria cried quietly behind her hand. Lucia held the check as if it were a fragile thing and saw Maria's face soften like new clay. The revelation, however, would come at the building that had rejected Lucia. The CEO, Mr. Langston, drove to the lobby himself in an unannounced visit to the sponsor committee. His arrival caused a ripple. Security protocols tightened, and heads turned. He walked to the reception desk where the earlier scene had felt so final, and he asked to speak with Carla, the receptionist. She regarded him with professional distance and said, "May I help you, Mr. Langston?" He said, "I came to understand why a promising candidate was turned away for being 3 minutes late," he said. He showed her the footage and the file and asked questions that sounded simple but were searching. He said, "Why did you not offer flexibility when the situation was clear?" She said, "We follow policy." He said, "Who wrote that policy?" She said, "The admissions committee." He said, "And who is on that committee?" She said, "Names that do not need repeating," he said. He asked for Mr. Bennett, the evaluator, and for Amelia, the administrator, and he listened to the reasons of process and fairness that sounded like a language designed to be immovable. Langston then did something that surprised the office. He asked to meet Lucia. He wanted to hear in her own words why she had made the choice and what the scholarship meant to her. He wanted to hear the story of why a small act of help mattered to a man who had once been helped himself. When Lucia arrived, she smelled of rain and determination, and the brass of her locket shone like a small, honest coin. He asked her to sit, and he waited while she smoothed her hands on her skirt. The room smelled of lemon. He said, "Tell me about the interview and the choice." Lucia described the rush of the morning, the bus, the smell of oil, the way the lug nut had stuck, and the way Henry had told her not to rush. She spoke of her mother, of the final notice, and of a lifetime of small denials. She kept the backstory of the locket and the promise to her grandmother out of modesty, but Mr. Langston saw the weight behind her eyes. He explained that he had been watching, not in the way of surveillance, but in the way of curiosity and of regret. He told a story about being young and hungry once, and about someone who tied his shoe. His voice was quiet, and it broke the formal tone in the room. He said, "We judge by criteria, and sometimes criteria need to be changed." He said, "We will not accept the verdict of one receptionist or one late clock." He said, "We will create a way to see the whole story." He offered Lucia a choice that was a soft mirror of the choice she had made in the rain. He said, "We can offer you a scholarship that will cover tuition and living expenses." He said, "We can also offer a paid apprenticeship at one of our foundation programs, a role that will give you experience in community outreach and a mentor who will work with you." He said, "It will not be charity," he said. "It will be structural support." Lucia felt the ground of her expectations shift and rearrange. He said, "We will also investigate the clocking policies here and see that fairness means humanity," he said. The offer was practical and material and carried the weight of a visible future. The resolution came quickly, with paperwork signed and with a small public note that the foundation would pilot a flexibility clause for candidates affected by emergencies. The foundation smiled in press photos, and the city papers ran a short piece that smelled of syrup and success. Lucia signed forms and held a pen that trembled under the rhythm of her hand. She accepted the apprenticeship and the scholarship, and the check that covered the apartment notice became a doorway. Not the whole road, but a threshold. The man she had helped, Henry Langston, visited the small apartment once, and Maria set out a pot of soup as if to honor the guest. He sat on a small plastic chair and listened as Maria told a story about a boy with flour on his hands from a photograph. He paid attention, and his attention felt like payment in itself. 1 month later, Lucia's mornings were different. She no longer rushed out of the house with only a borrowed suit. Instead, she walked to a small office where she learned how to coordinate programs and how to read grant proposals. She learned to transcribe interviews and to write clear notes that steered money to people like her family. The brass locket still rested against her chest, and the city still smelled of fried onions and wet asphalt. But the clock on the wall at the office showed 8:30, and she was not moving against time. She was part of it. Her mother, Maria, had a day off from an unexpected extra shift, and she cooked a stew that smelled like victory. The check that had covered the final notice had been replaced with a formal payment schedule, and the landlord smiled with a practiced, neutral face, because the transaction now had documentation and legitimacy. 3 months later, Lucia spoke at a small event where she told her story in a room of people who had been given second chances. The stage lights were warm, and the microphone amplified the small tremor in her voice into a steady cadence. She described with a journalist's clarity the chain of events from a rain-soaked morning to a desk with a name badge that said, "Rules are rules." She said, "You help the person in front of you," and the room repeated the phrase like a chorus. She had a mentor named Amelia who taught her the technical vocabulary of foundations, and a case manager named Jorge who helped her file forms without feeling small. The scholarship covered tuition, and the apprenticeship paid a modest stipend. She enrolled in courses and learned how policy and human stories braided together to change outcomes. 6 months after the night of the rain, Lucia had a small office of her own in a program that pulled applications from neighborhoods like hers. She had a chair with a cushion and a small plant that she watered carefully. The brass locket had a small scratch on it now, and she wore it openly as a reminder of the day she chose to stay. She visited her old school and spoke with students about the ethics of small acts and about how systems sometimes need to be nudged by simple courage. She and Maria ate better meals, not extravagant, but steady, and the final notice had become an anecdote, not a threat. Her former evaluator, Mr. Bennett, had been part of a round table where policies were discussed, and he had written an email apologizing for his earlier curt note. The city did not change overnight, but there was a small ripple of policy that allowed for compassion in exceptional storms. The legacy of the day lived in small things. A neighbor stopped rushing past and asked if she needed help with groceries. A bus driver named Samir waved with a friendlier whistle. Rosa, the neighbor, received a small repair for her roof, and the housekeeper network received resources to enroll in a certification course. Mr. Langston kept a photograph of the old woman who had once helped him, and he wrote a short note to the foundation that said, "Do not lose sight of those small acts. They matter." He came to one community event and listened quietly as people told their stories. He did not seek applause, and he did not ask for credit. He had simply remembered that someone had tied his shoelace once, and that memory had become a compass for decisions. In the end, Lucia lost an interview and gained a life. Her name appeared on a list of scholarship recipients, and in small emails that told her she had been accepted. For her mother, Maria, the victory was practical and tender, and for the neighborhood, it was a small precedent of fairness. The final scene is not a fairy tale, but a steady workday with routines of dignity. She kept the brass locket polished, and sometimes when she walked past a corner where the rain had been worst, she would pause and touch it, and whisper a thank you to the stranger who had taught her that help given when no one asked for it is a kind of currency that can be spent on futures. If this story touched you, consider subscribing for more accounts of ordinary decisions that changed lives. If you enjoyed this portrait of how small ethics collide with big institutions, like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that small kindnesses matter. The story ends not with a single reward, but with a network of changes that built a bridge from a crowded apartment to a place where scholarship and work met in a practical design. Lucia's life did not perfect itself overnight, but the choice she made on a wet morning became a hinge on which a different world turned. You helped the person in front of you, and sometimes that will come back in a way you never expected.